The Alliance for Charitable Reform is a project of the Philanthropy Roundtable that educates legislators and policymakers about the central role of private giving in American life and the importance of protecting philanthropic freedom. I'm Marcus Chavez, Communications Director at the Alliance for Charitable Reform. Today I'm joined by Howard Husock, the Vice President for Policy Research at the Manhattan Institute. Today we're going to discuss your recent report on donor-advised funds called Growing Giving, American Philanthropy, and the Potential of Donor-Advised Funds.
Great. Thanks for having me, Marcus.
Yeah, absolutely. We've seen a recent increase in popularity in the use of donor-advised funds over the last several years. Howard, can you explain a little bit about that?
Well, the growth has been really quite phenomenal. Since 2007, the number of DAF accounts has grown by 40,000. So when we say DAF accounts, we mean individual donor-advised funds directed by people, but all the money doesn't have to be dispersed in any one year the way a traditional check to charity is dispersed. And many have been in the so-called national donor-advised funds, Schwab, Fidelity, Vanguard, but also in community foundations. So that means they've gone from 72,000 total donor-advised funds to 112,000 donor-advised funds. And the actual gifts have also risen tremendously from $6.47 billion to $9.66 billion. And those are 2013 figures. We're still awaiting the updated figures. So this is the growth sector of American philanthropy.
All right, I want to read a quick excerpt from your study. As a practical matter, concern to date about the pace of DAF distributions, itself a reflection of the assumption that rapid distributions are positive, does not appear warranted. Now, there are two issues in that statement I want to ask you about. First, could you talk a little bit about the concerns over the payout of funds of DAFs? You point out that the payout rate for DAFs is actually pretty high.
Well, this has become an issue. To me, it's reforms proposed about payout are solutions in search of a problem. And I don't see there being a problem. The critics say, well, the capital might just sit there forever. It might never be dispersed to charities. It's already received the tax benefit of being dispersed. One has to wonder, why would somebody let it sit there forever? What would their motivation be? And in fact, they don't. So that, for instance, Fidelity has estimated that 63% of all contributions since 1991 have already been expended as grants, 20% of assets every year. And for a whole group, the national donor-advised funds report 21% payout annually. Now that's a lot more than private foundations are paying out. They take their 5% floor as a ceiling a lot of times. So we're seeing very active turnover among these funds, and to be concerned about the payout rate seems misguided to me. And I would just add, Marcus, that Fidelity, which is the largest of the national funds, estimates that 90% of all contributions are distributed within 10 years. So that's a record that Bill Gates is now matching.
Well, somewhat related to that, you also expressed some skepticism that rapid distribution of funds in DAFs is the best use for them. I mean, could you elaborate as to perhaps why not spend right away?
Well, I think we're seeing an emerging conventional wisdom that checks need to be written this year to organizations that provide direct services to those in need. And certainly food banks and emergency assistance of all kind deserves Americans' support. But we also need what I call patient capital. Let's find out what trends are going to be changing. People who start these donor-advised funds, they may start them in their 60s and think about dispersing those funds over the next 25 years, the remainder of their lives. And they may want to see, well, what's changing in the world? I want to still have the discretion to support cost-effective, imaginative, promising funds. Imagine that it was 1952 and polio was an epidemic, because it was. And there would have been pressure on donors, we need to invest in iron lungs to keep people alive. Well, would it have been better to do that or wait 5 years and invest in distribution of the Salk vaccine? You could not have anticipated those needs. And so we need to have a reserve of philanthropic capital in the United States to seize opportunities. Not only that, when there are financial downturns, you want there to be reserve pools, in effect, a giant rainy day fund, because that's what happened in the 2007, 2008 financial crisis. Philanthropy was able to step up and remain nearly constant in its giving because it had these quasi-endowments.
Okay. I want to ask you about some of the policy related to DAFs. In 2014, Representative Dave Camp, who was then chairman of the House Ways and Means Committee, he proposed that that DAFs ought to be distributed within 5 years or face a 20% excise tax. You examined some of the potential effects that could happen if a policy like that were enacted. Can you explain a little bit about that?
Well, I think that it's a strong deterrent to giving, but not only that. One of the most attractive aspects of the donor-advised funds as administered nationally is their low administrative carrying cost. If every community foundation and every major financial firm had to track when did the money come in and when did the money go out, each individual check, and make sure that it's all dispersed in 5 years, well, you're going to see an explosion of carrying costs that are going to actually detract from charitable giving, which is the goal. And so critics who want the rapid disbursements and the tracking that would have to be enacted to enforce that are talking out of both sides of their mouth, because they want the money to go directly to charities as much as possible, and then they want to impose administrative costs that would diminish the amount of money being dispersed to charities. So I think Representative Camp was well-meaning but poorly informed.
All right. We've talked a little bit about this explosion in the use of DAFs. You talk about how we've seen this large increase. That doesn't necessarily mean it automatically will lead to an increase in charitable giving, but that the potential is there. Can you explain a little bit about that potential and what some of the factors are that lead to that potential?
Yeah. Well, one of the most interesting things about DAFs is when funds are deposited in a donor-advised fund, they're not static. They are invested, right? And so when you talk about the major national financial firms, these are engines of investment. This is what they do. And so you're going to see accumulation. The magic of compound interest is going to be applied to these, in effect, what amount to mini personal endowments that can only be used for charitable purposes. They will gain in value over the decades, my report estimates, but in the hundreds of billions of dollars. And so this is new money that can only be used for philanthropy. And so to me, this is a promising new philanthropy-only investment pool.
All right. I want to ask you one last question. Sure. This is actually related to your latest column in Forbes. And it touched upon some of the topics we've discussed here already, but you take on those who criticize philanthropy that doesn't go to the immediate alleviation of need. Like I said, this is clearly a topic that spans charitable giving as a whole. Can you explain a little bit more about your thoughts on why those critics may be a little bit misplaced in some of the criticism?
Well, we've seen an emerging school of thought that might be called the hierarchy of needs school, that certain immediate alleviation of suffering is a higher order version of philanthropy than investing in the endowments of colleges and universities or museums, the arts. And one of the targets of that criticism most recently was John Paulson, the hedge fund billionaire in New York, who gave the largest gift in the history of Harvard University to help the university start a much expanded engineering school. And I understand that John Paulson could have started the largest soup kitchen in New York, which already has quite a few food pantries. But who knows what inventions are going to be catalyzed by that gift, inventions that are going to help people of all income levels, that are going to lift incomes. And so this is a time horizon issue. And we also often see this in a divide between left and right, the immediate versus the potential. And so to me, the longer term patient capital holds the potential for serving the greater good in ways that we can't even quite imagine yet. And let's be real. For all the criticism about where philanthropy is going, this is a small portion of our gross domestic product. To micromanage it in these kind of ways, something else must be motivating the critics. I think it's animosity toward the rich, the belief that fundamentally the funds ought to be directed to the government and spent, become in the form of tax revenue, to be directed as other tax revenues, because the amounts are so relatively small that the animus is just very difficult to understand.
Well, again, the report is Growing Giving, American Philanthropy, and the Potential of Donor-Advised Funds. Howard, thanks for taking a few minutes to discuss these issues.
Well, thank you, Marcus, and it can be found on the Manhattan Institute website.
All right.